Testament reading is from the book of Obadiah, and I will be reading the entire book, which is 21 verses. If you want to read along with me, it's found on page 1443 in your Pew Bible. 33. Or 33. Did I say 43?
Yes.
Gee, I thought I was awake. The vision of Obadiah. This is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom. We have heard a message from the Lord. An envoy was sent to the nations to say, "Rise, let us go against her for battle. See, I will make you small among the nations. You will be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights. You who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagles and you make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. If thieves came to you, if robbers in the night, oh, what a disaster awaits you. Would they not steal only as much as they wanted? If grape pickers came to you, would they not leave a few grapes? But how Esau will be ransacked, his hidden treasures pillaged. All of your allies will force you to the border. Your friends will deceive you and overpower you. Those who eat your bread will set a trap for you, but you will not detect it. In that day, declares the Lord, will I not destroy the wise men of Edom, men of understanding in the mountains of Esau? Your warriors, O Timon, will be terrified, and everyone in Esau's mountain will be cut down in the slaughter. Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever. On the day you stood aloft while strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates, and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. You should not look down on your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their disaster, nor look down on them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. You should not wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives, nor hand over their survivors in the day of their trouble. The day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and be as if they had never been. But on Mount Zion will be deliverance. It will be holy. And the house of Jacob will possess its inheritance. The house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. The house of Esau will be stubble, and they will set it on fire and consume it. There will be no survivors from the house of Esau. The Lord has spoken. People from the Negev will occupy the mountains of Esau, and the people from the foothills will possess the land of the Philistines. They will occupy the fields of Ephraim and Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. This company of Israelite exiles who are in Canaan will possess the land as far as Zarephath. The exiles from Jerusalem who are in Shepherah will possess the towns of the Negev. Deliverers will go up on Mount Zion to govern the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Now I am assuming that most of you know very little about Obadiah or the book that is attributed to him. And that is completely understandable, as nobody really knows much about this Obadiah. We know that Obadiah is a common name in the Bible, but we really don't know much about this Obadiah. Unfortunately, the writer of this prophecy makes it hard for us to even figure out what time frame he is writing in. Therefore, the scholars are left to speculate, and the speculations range from anywhere starting with the 800s BC to about 500 BC. About the only thing anybody can say with absolute certainty about this book is that it is the shortest book in the Old Testament. What we do know a whole lot more about is the history that existed between Edom and Israel. It is one filled with family rivalries going back to Genesis. The Edomites were descendants of Esau, the twin brother of Jacob. In Genesis 25, we read about the birth of these two twins, Esau and Jacob. During the pregnancy, their mother, Rebekah, wife of Isaac, felt a whole lot of jostling going on in her womb, and she inquired of the Lord about that. God tells Rebekah that the jostling was because in her womb there were two nations that were already beginning to start the jostling back and forth that would take place later in history. When the birth of the twins came, Esau was the first to come out, and therefore should have inherited everything from his father Isaac. As we continue reading the 25th chapter, we find out that Daddy loved Esau better, but Mommy loved Jacob better. Now, I don't have to explain to you what sort of problems can result when you have parents picking favorite children. Then when we go to chapter 20, or a little bit further in this story, we find that Jacob one day was able to extort Esau into selling Esau's birthright. So Jacob now has the birthright that belongs to Esau. And then in chapter 27, we get what might be the most vicious thing that happens. Rebekah concocts a plan to trick Isaac into giving his blessing to Jacob instead of Esau when Isaac was at the end of his life. Needless to say, this is one messed up family. And I would feel sorry for the family counselor who would have to try to sort out this mess. Obviously, with such a family dynamic going on, it would be expected that trouble is ahead. And indeed, trouble is ahead. There was a long history of friction between the nations of Edom, which was started by Esau, and the nation of Israel, which was started by Jacob. In Numbers 20, verses 14 through 21, we read the story of how during the Exodus journey, Moses discovers that the path from where they are to where the promised land is goes through the land of Edom. So Moses politely sends a messenger saying to the king of Edom, we want to pass through. We are not going to attack you. Just let us pass through. The king of Edom said, no way. Moses sends a second request saying, and by the way, in case I didn't make it clear, if our livestock cause any damage while we're walking down the main road of your country, we will pay for that damage. The king of Edom responds with not only no, but it's backed up with a large military presence. As a result, Moses got the hint and went around Edom, of course, prolonging the journey. Getting into the prophecy itself, Obadiah starts off with a shocking statement. God himself is rousing the nations to defeat Edom. After declaring that Edom will be laid to waste in verse 2, the prophet declares that the primary reason for Edom's downfall in verse 3, the reasoning is because Edom has too much pride in itself. As we read in Proverbs 16, verse 18, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before the fall. And Edom is going to find out that that proverb is absolutely true. Edom's capital city was built on a high plain with only one way into the capital. Because of that security device, the nation was overconfident that nobody would be able to defeat them. Notice the last half of verse 3, which reads, you who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Friends, anytime you ask the question, who can bring me down, you're asking a very dangerous question. I remember as a little kid, somebody will say, you better do something or else. And the response would be, you and what army? I'm sure some of you probably remember those type of conversations too. In the case of the Edomites, God saw their statement as a direct challenge. And when the Edomites said, who's going to bring us down? God says, you know what? I will. In verse 4, we see God declaring, if you're going to ask, who's going to bring me down? I'm going to do it. God points out that even though the Edomites are soaring as high as eagles, and their nests are perched up in the stars, even from such lofty heights, God can, and in this case, God will knock them from their perch. While working on this message, my love for football sort of caught the better of me, and I pictured New Orleans Saints fans, especially when they have good teams. I remember visiting New Orleans in the 1980s when they were having a great run, and as I went down Bourbon Street, I kept hearing New Orleans fans chanting, who dat? Who dat? Who dat say they're going to beat them Saints? Well, if God was there and it was the Edomites, God says, I will. Once again, as Matthew Henry declares in his commentary, if somebody asks, who's going to bring me down? The answer is, God will. In verses 4 and 5, God gives a hint as to how devastating the destruction will be. He mentions robbers and those who were grape pickers. When they come, they will always leave something behind. I remember in California, our house was robbed. But even though our house was robbed, there were quite a few things left behind. When people do their picking, especially under Old Testament law, they would always leave a little left over so that the poor could come by and have something to eat. But God is saying to the Edomites, even your hidden treasures will be pillaged. In verse 7, God goes on to say, you know, Edom, you think you have some friends? Well, those friends of yours are setting a trap, and you don't even see it coming. Then jumping down to verse 10, we see God's justification for the coming total destruction of the descendants of Esau. It is because of the violence they have committed against their brother Jacob, which is the Old Testament way of saying their brother the Israelites. Because of that violence, the Edomites are going to be forever destroyed. Now, if you want an easy way to prove that God did indeed forever blot the Edomites from the face of the earth, I will ask you a simple question. When was the last time you met an Edomite? Or even saw one on TV? While Israel has been destroyed a number of times in history, even today there are still Israelites among us. But Edomites? I have never seen one, and I'm pretty sure neither have you. The indictment continues in verses 11 through 14. In verse 11, we are told that the people of Edom stood aloof while strangers carried away their brother's wealth and destroyed the temple. Psalm 137:7 goes even further. The psalmist there declares, not only did Edom stand and watch, they were actually cheerleaders cheering the Babylonians on as they were doing their pillaging of Israel. Perhaps, however, the most serious offense is found in verse 14, where it's revealed that not only did the Edomites cheer on the Babylonians, they aided and abetted the invading forces by standing in the roads of the escape routes, and when their Israelite brothers were trying to escape, the Edomites either struck them down or captured them and handed them over to the invaders. Talk about brotherly love. There's a common phrase that I hear quite often called the Boomerang theory, and I'm sure many of you know it. It's printed down at the bottom of your bulletin this morning. It declares that what goes around comes around. Much like a boomerang, when it's properly thrown, you can throw it out, and then it comes back to the thrower. The Lord in verse 15 says, you know what? The boomerang theory is more than a theory. It is reality. The Lord continues by saying that the end is near for all the nations. And what they have done, what we have done, will be done to us. Once again, in other words, God is saying indeed, what goes around will come around. And that can be bad news. The good news, however, is that there will be deliverance available. Obadiah declares that Mount Zion will be the source of deliverance. Those of us who trust in Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord will be with him on Mount Zion come Judgment Day. Now, I'm going to go through verses 17 through 21 fairly quickly. It has been used by many pastors to issue statements about how, as a nation, we need to be careful about how we treat the nation of Israel. While they have a point, I think those pastors are missing a more important point that we need to remember, especially since the current nation of Israel is no longer God's exclusive chosen people. What we need to do instead of worrying about Israel is worry about our own attitudes. For example, how do we respond when those whom we find reprehensible get what we think they deserve? As I mentioned, there was bad blood between the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Esau or Edom. Perhaps some of that anger that the Edomites had against the Israelites were justified. However, the psalmist in the 4th chapter, verse 4, and Paul in Ephesians 4:26 cautions us not to let our anger lead us to sin. I remember back, been quite a while now, probably 12, 13 years ago, one of Sarah's best friends was brutally raped in a homecoming dance. As it turns out, one of the 5 perpetrators, a juvenile, had charges dismissed against him because of a potential technicality. It was not really clear whether or not he had his rights read to him before he talked to the police. I was angry that a mere technicality let a person get off with such a heinous crime. About 2 months later, as I was teaching a law class in the high school that I was working in, I had a new student come in. At one point, he started bringing up the case because it had made worldwide news, and one of my students shut him down real quickly. And fortunately, this student was wise enough to know, hey, I'll talk to the teacher after class. Turns out his last class was taught in juvenile hall. And I explained to him why my students shut him down pretty quick. He and I talked for a minute or two later, and I went, by the way, did you know the juvenile who was let go because of the technicality? And he goes, oh yeah. And I said, how was his treatment while he was still in juvenile hall before the release? And he looked at me and he goes, you know how the adult prisons treat rapists? And I go, yeah. And he said, we did the same thing to this jerk. I have to confess that at the time I was like, well, at least there's some justice. Yes. But as I read Obadiah, I realize that was an unbecoming attitude I had. I was no better than the Edomites who stood in the way of the Israelites trying to escape. Fortunately, God is a forgiving God. And fortunately, I can be assured that God has forgiven me of that sin. It is true that we can take comfort in the fact that God is a just God and will avenge wrongdoing. However, we need to be careful that we do not react like the Edomites when we see God's justice coming on somebody who we don't like. We need to remember that the boomerang theory is a heavenly reality, and it is indeed used by the Almighty. What we do to others will be done unto us. With that in mind, let us be out in our community doing good work and sharing the message of salvation through Jesus Christ, so that when the boomerang returns to us, we will receive good and not evil. Amen.
Amen.